I also want to remind the board and the public and all the folks that are listening that this is essentially still a narrative-based, technology-based effluent limitation permit. This is not dissimilar at all from the 92 and 97. The enhanced areas had to do with the increased data quality and the feedback loop I just described with the numeric action levels and the exceedance response actions that are associated with it. But really, this is still a narrative-based approach. We would like to ensure proper steps towards the true numeric-based, and so we're committed to doing that in the next reissuance, as well as the strategic work plan that's going to roll out in the next couple of months, where we can capture those kind of ideas. So with that, I'm going to hand over, actually, timeline. This is the painful slide. So in 1991, we adopted the first State Water Board Industrial General Permit. It's actually Order 92.
Greg, no swords this time. Only sports metaphors, no blood and gore metaphors today.
This is not painful then. This is really therapeutic. The 97, in 97, we reissued the 92 permit on time, and then in 2003, we started working towards reissuing again. We were somewhat derailed for the discussion about the role of numerics in stormwater permits as a whole. The expert panel was convened, we listened to them, and we started work on the construction permit immediately thereafter, which put this on a shelf for a little while. In 2011, we picked this up again. We had hearings over the last 3 years, essentially. I believe it's 7 hearings and workshops. I could check the number, but it's a lot. And then in July of this last year, we reissued a significant draft, and then the change draft, the 2014 draft, was actually just in March, or excuse me, in February, and the changes associated with that were considered minor, and they lead up to the adoption meeting today. We have a change sheet before you, and we're hopeful that this takes effect on July 1 of 2015. So with that, I'm going to hand over the slide clicker to Leo Cosentini.
Good morning. Just for the board members to know, I worked on the first draft of this permit in 2002. So it's been 12 years, and I believe 7 drafts in those 12 years. So thus the suit to celebrate. I'm going to try to go as fast as I can, going over what the changes are to the 97 permit. Not going to go over all the drafts and things like that, but what are the sort of the fundamental large changes from 97 to this one? The first major change is we're, just like the construction permit before, we're going to go fully electronic. We're going to be using our SMART system, stormwater multi-application reporting and tracking system. That's what SMARTS means. And so it'll be 100% electronic, other than perhaps some confidential information that people may have to mail to us. It will be from the very beginning, from the permit registration documents to the notice of termination. Everything will be 100% electronic. Our experience with the construction permit was that not everyone's savvy using the internet and electronic databases, but generally they get it after a while. They use it a couple of times, and they'll be able to use it. So we plan on having a lot of outreach. We're going to develop training for it. We're going to try to meet, especially with companies that have multiple facilities. We're going to try to meet with them, maybe train their trainers, so we can get some assistance on that. Whether you're an environmental advocate or an industry advocate, we've been beat up in the past for not getting the data that we've got on these annual reports and putting it into a single database. It's very difficult and time-consuming to do something like that. That problem will go away now. We're going to get all this data is going to be input by the dischargers into a single database, be available for the public to analyze, be available for staff to analyze, and hopefully the board can make informed decisions on numerics and things like that in the future. Let's see. No, I'll do it. Okay. Stormwater pollution prevention plan requirements. There's a few changes. in there. First of all, the 97 permit sort of had suggested BMPs, but didn't really require, didn't really mandate it. This permit has a requirement to implement BMPs, and they're broken up into two. They're all based upon the EPA multi-sector permit with a little bit of tweaking. The main tweak is that we broke them up into two. We have minimum best management practices. Those are the operational type of management practices, things like good housekeeping, sweeping, cleaning up, that type, closing a lid on something, that type of thing. And many facilities can comply with this permit just doing those. If they don't have a lot of materials outside, or the materials are solids and not easily transported by contact with rainwater, that might be all they need to do. Then there's another suite called advanced BMPs. And the advanced BMPs are more structural related. So we always use our pile of salt example. You got a pile of salt outside. Obviously, if rain hits it, it's going to be transported off, and you have contaminated stormwater. Well, you really only have three choices at that point. You can cover it, put a structure over it. That's expensive. You can contain it. Don't discharge that water. Keep it on site. Or the third one is you can treat it. Those are your three, and those are expensive. And those are the things that you have to consider if you have uncontrolled pollutants on your site. Where the minimum BMPs aren't going to be effective, then you have to look at those. Let's see here. Well, and I've already gone over this slide about the different type of advanced BMPs, and one thing to remember is that when you put in treatment control BMPs, we now have a design storm standard built in the permit to give people some guidance on what they need to do. The standard is, and it comes from the LA SUSMP requirements and the CASQA BMP Manual, is the 85th percentile 24-hour storm. That is fairly well documented. That's pretty effective. We hope that it will prove over a 5-year period that will be effective in reducing pollutants in the stormwater discharges. It may not be effective for impaired water bodies, and we may have to have dischargers may have to go above that for impaired water bodies. There's not a requirement for dischargers who currently have treatment systems that are beneath that 85th percentile to retrofit. They would only need to do that as their sampling data, if the sampling data is high or something, they might have to retrofit, but there's no requirement on day one to do that. It's only for new treatment. Let's see here. There's something new in this permit that the 97 permit didn't have, and we're addressing when facilities temporarily close. In the 97 permit, when facilities would close, they weren't required to sample, they weren't required to do any monitoring, but we didn't get anything out of it. They didn't have to, there was no requirement to stabilize the site, there was no requirement to inform us that they were closed, and so this permit has very pretty precise requirements. It says if you're closed 2 weeks or more, you have to, 1, tell us that you're closing. 2, you have to tell us what your site stabilization plan is. You just can't leave a bunch of stuff outside and walk away. And then you have to, when you reopen, you have to tell us that you've reopened. So we know then that you're not gaming the system and just eliminating sampling and without us knowing about it. And so that's a real improvement. And I don't think it's going to cause too much burden. Not that many facilities close for that long, but some do if they're above the snow line or something like that. The other change is we now have what's called a monitoring implementation plan, a MIP. That was absent in the 97 permit. We've always told dischargers what to do, but we've never told them to actually plan it out. And in this permit, it tells dischargers, plan out tell us where your sampling locations are, tell us how you're going to do it, who's going to do it, how you're going to do it, and that's going to benefit the discharger. One of the goals of this permit is to get better quality data, and if people are just sort of randomly picking points to collect sampling, that doesn't lead to better sampling data. So this is a way, and they'll have to put that in SMART, so we'll be able to look at that. And
Now, Leo, is MIP a term of art, or have you just made up a new IP for me to go with SIPs and FIPs? And I like
it's not even
IPs.
on there. So
Did you just make that up, or is that a
no,
term
no,
of art?
we used to have it as an acronym.
Uh-huh.
I believe we took it out now.
Great. I'm just like adding IPs to my glossary of terms. Thank you.
Okay, then there's some changes in the monitoring requirements. The 97 permit required quarterly observations of both authorized and unauthorized non-stormwater discharges. It had a monthly requirement to observe to visually observe stormwater discharging. It didn't have a requirement for dischargers to periodically look at their BMPs, except there was an annual one, but that needs to be done more frequently, we feel. So what we've done is we've come up with this single monthly observation that sort of does all that. It requires inspection, a look at your authorized non-stormwater discharges, look for any unauthorized ones, look at any authorized ones, take a look at your BMPs, see if everything's right, see if there's been any changes at your site that aren't being addressed properly. So that's done on a monthly basis. It's not meant that the dischargers have to report all that information to us, but it's just meant as a requirement to sort of keep up with their facility. Because regional boards have gone to facilities where the plan is perfectly good. It was a perfectly good plan 6 months ago, but it's not a perfectly good plan today. The 97 permit, it talked about a sampling contained stormwater, but it didn't address bypass at all. It just was silent on it. So this permit does require that when sampling is performed, if there happens to be any bypass, so if it's a really big storm, you also have to sample the bypass. In the interest of trying to allow dischargers more frequency to sample, we've tried to ease up on the rules. The 97 permit said that you have to wait at least 3 working days of dry weather before you could sample again. So depending on weekends and holidays, it might be 6 days that you'd have to wait for dry weather. And so sometimes a storm would come 3 or 4 days later, and they couldn't sample it because there wasn't enough time. So we've reduced that to 48 hours, period. Not working days, just 48 hours, in the interest of trying to make sure the dischargers can get their samples. We also allow the 97 permit if it rained at night. And there's been a couple of years where most of the storms have started at nighttime. Well, dischargers showed up and they said, well, it's already rained. We can't get our sample in the first hour. So now we've changed that. So if it starts raining in the preceding 12 hours, they can still sample it. And that might lead to some interesting observations, because we'll see samples that are taken in the first 4 hours period versus samples that might have been taken 10 or 12 hours later. And we don't have any information on that. That might be really of interest down the road. Let's see. The 97 permit required 2 samples a year. And this permit now requires 4 samples a year. It's more in line with the U.S. multi-sector EPA multi-sector permit and lots of other state permits, and we think it'll better characterize the discharge from sites having 4. We changed it in order to make sure that there's less confusion. The 2 prior to January 1 and 2 after. And there's no requirement if you miss one or you just are unable to get it because it didn't rain enough, you don't have to carry it over. You just still do 2 in the next half of the year. So there's no penalty for that. Let's see, what's the... And I already mentioned that the requirement is to capture the stormwater 4 hours after it starts to rain, or if it started to rain at night, 12 hours, or after 12 hours. I always get ahead of myself here. There's a few other items that are different. In the 97 permit, we require dischargers to sample and test for pH, but they would send it to a laboratory, and And really, you need to actually take a test of pH within 15 minutes, or it goes to 7 pretty quickly. So so this permit, we allow dischargers to use pH paper if they want, and just take it out in the field. And if they get 2 exceedances, then they have to get a pH meter or properly get it to a lab in 15 minutes, which is virtually impossible, but they'll probably just have to get a pH meter and do it themselves. We fooled around with a lot of other these aren't actually big changes. One thing that's better is the 97 permit allowed dischargers, if they had, like, say, 2 or more entire drainage areas that they thought were really similar, they could omit sampling from one of those. We found that to be problematic, and so we've removed that. They now have to sample all drainage areas. We've retained the ability for them to combine up to 4 of those together. We know that sort of dilutes it, but we felt uncomfortable, staff felt uncomfortable them not sampling at all from a drainage area. So that's been tweaked a little bit. We still have sampling frequency reduction in this permit. The 97 permit had that. It was really convoluted in the 97 permit. This one's really straightforward. If you can go from 4 to 2, if you get 4 straight samples with no exceedances, then you can then go from 4 samples a year to 2 samples a year. It was really straightforward. Let's see here. Then sort of the bread and butter of this permit, which is completely different, not addressed at all in the 97 permit, is our exceedance response action process. And this was developed in order to hopefully determine by the end of the 5-year period if dischargers are in compliance with the permit or not. We now have, unlike the 97 permit, we now have numeric action levels built in this permit. They're all from the EPA multi-sector permit. They're the same values. And we have 2 types of exceedances that we've defined. One is just an annual average. If you just take all the sampling that you did from all your sampling location and just average it, and if it's below the numeric action level, that's not an exceedance. And if it's above, that's considered an exceedance, and you'll now go from baseline to level 1. There's another one, it's called an instantaneous maximum NAL exceedance, and it only applies to TSS, total suspended solids, oil and grease, and pH. And that is, for TSS, for instance, the value is 400 milligrams per liter as opposed to 100, which is just the NAL, the numeric action level. That was done through a statistical model figuring out what high value is for TSS based on our database that we had. And if you get 2 or more samples that are above that instantaneous maximum NAL exceedance, that's another driver to put you in level 1 from baseline. Let's see here. So basically, the way the permit works, everyone starts in baseline. It doesn't, regardless of past sampling data, they all start in baseline. And they just do their minimum BMPs and advanced BMPs and make their inspections and do their 4 qualified storm events. Once they get one of those exceedances, it doesn't matter what time of year they get it, on July 1 of the next year, they go to level 1. And the permit then requires what's called level 1 exceedance response actions. In level 1, that's rather, and this is sort of a diagram of how the triggers work. And I'll go quickly on it. That just shows you can go to level 1 and level 2, but we don't want to get into too much detail here. The status changes on July 1. There's a requirement that you then hire. You have to get a QUISP, either have someone trained on your staff to take the QUISP training. Qualified industrial stormwater practitioner is a QUISP. Or you can hire a QUISP. There'll be lots of people taking this training. Laurel's going to talk about the training element later. And then you have a requirement that by October 1, you have 3 months to evaluate your site, see if there's any sources that are causing that exceedance on site, tweak your SWIP, whatever you need to do to see if you can eliminate those exceedances in the future. And then by January 1, you have that till that time to actually change your SWIP or implement the BMPs, what have you. We also built in, there was a concern by the discharger community that while they were putting in their BMPs, they could get a storm, just say in September, that happens a lot, and they would get into level 2 before they even put in their BMPs. And we didn't want that. So we built something in so that we don't, if a storm happens before October 1 and they haven't put their BMPs in yet, that won't count as an exceedance to put them in level 2. If in some subsequent year, while they're in level 1, they have another type of exceedance for that same pollutant, they go to level 2. And these are there's very comprehensive requirements in level 2. The level 1 was pretty straightforward. You're just looking at your facility, looking at your plan. This one had the level 2 ERA exceedances is comprehensive. There's a requirement to do an action plan, and the action plan is a determination that you're making. What's causing this exceedance? Is it us? Is it industrial activities that are causing it? Do we suspect it's natural background because there's just lead in the ground everywhere and it's just blowing in from nearby fields? Is it non-industrial pollutant sources? If it's just coming from downspouts and chain link fences and of that nature? So you have to, what's required is that you have to lay out what you think it is and how you're going to go about proving what that is, or what you're going to do to implement additional BMPs. So you have 6 months to do that, and then the permit gives up to a year to actually give us a technical report that tells us or proves that this is, it either says here's what we're going to do to not have any more exceedances, here's what we're going to do, but we still may have exceedances. We can't spend any more than reverse osmosis would be too expensive and not economically achievable, but we are going to do this other lesser treatment one. Or here's our proof that it's non-industrial pollutants or it's natural background. There is something built in where a discharger can ask for a six-month extension, and often if you're going to put treatment systems in and stuff, you may have to get a permit from the county or the city, and that takes time. And well, in this slide are the three demonstrations that could be done in the technical report. Well, that's it. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly go through some of the more special requirements in the permit. One of them is, we've talked about many times, is the training for the Qualified Industrial Stormwater Practitioner Program. Basically, the discharger gets a QISP for a lot of the actions that Leo just discussed. The class is designed to be a higher level. There aren't any prerequisites for those certifications, like a certain degree or anything, but it's supposed to be a more specialized training to compliance with this permit at the certain actions QISPs have to do. And only dischargers, when they get into level 1 and above, have to get a QISP, so it's not for every discharger. And they have a few actions as well as new dischargers that are potentially discharging to impaired water bodies. We have a parallel process for engineers. They don't have to take the in-class or online training designed for QISPs. They have a governing board that manages their licenses, so we don't have to do the same kind of level of effort for QISPs for engineers. They will be doing a similar process for the construction general permit, where they do an online set of slides, get their number, and go on with their business. We also have a compliance group, which is an adaptation of the group monitoring in the current 97 permit. Dischargers in a compliance group, they get a little bit of a sampling reduction, 50%. They have to have substantial industrial activities, not necessarily their industrial codes. For example, an auto dismantler can't be with a can recycler. They have to have a compliance group leader that's basically the trainer of the QISPs, which we call the trainer of record. They have to do an annual inspection, and they do some of the reporting for the dischargers. And the water boards at this time, which was a little different than a construction permit, they can actually weigh in on the groups and the leaders. This permit also has we adopt the conditional exclusion for no exposure certifications. That's a federal requirement, and they have it in the multi-sectoral general permit. Any kind of industrial sector can get a no exposure certification if they meet the 11 categories of no exposure, submit the checklist, the fee, and the regional boards don't kick and scream and say that there's a problem with the site. They don't have to do the stormwater pollution prevention plan or the monitoring. It's a pretty good deal if you can qualify. We've also defined no discharge as far as the notice of non-applicability, which is in the California Water Code. This has been a pretty interesting piece of the puzzle for this permit. And we allow dischargers to claim no discharge, meaning they don't discharge to waters of the state or via groundwater or just surface water. Or they have been, they're just in a basin that's hydrologically disconnected from water of the state. And in the last changes we've made, there's been some clarifications to this that have been asked for. And they have to have an engineer do these kinds of determinations. We've also have the TMDL, total maximum daily load reopener, where we're going to develop implementation language with the regional boards and potentially reopen the permit July 1 of 2016 to add in these requirements. And recently, since March 2014, we've added 3 TMDLs to our attachment that look like they have industrial discharges. We also have, related to receiving waters, the 303D impaired water bodies. New dischargers, unless they meet certain criteria, they cannot get a permit, an industrial general permit, unless they go through this process of determining if they have 303D impairments or not, and they use the QISP to help them with this evaluation. Existing dischargers may have additional monitoring for these impairments in this new permit. We also have implemented discharges to ocean water language from the California Ocean Plan, where we can't give a permit to someone who is not following the monitoring provisions in the ocean plan for discharges or if they have outfalls to the ocean, as well as for areas of special biological significance. They have to meet those conditions to get our permit. We have plastic materials. This is from Assembly Bill 258, and this has been an ongoing effort to look at pre-production plastics, not trash in particular. And the individuals in this permit that they have pre-production plastic materials, they can meet our containment from the AB 258 or meet our 8 best management practices proposed by the board to also meet those requirements. So there's 2 ways to pretty much meet those requirements. And then I'm going to hand it to Greg, and he's going to talk about the change sheet. Thank you.
So we prepared a change sheet for today. This would be supplemental to the draft that was released a week and a half ago. On Thursday of last week, we emailed the change sheet to the Industrial General Permit notification list, LIRIS list. And on Friday, we emailed it to the board agenda LIRIS list. We also have a response to comments document that was made available on Friday of last week at about 3 p.m. to both of those lists. There are some paper copies in the room, but one of them is lengthy, so we didn't bring a lot. It's 200 pages of response to comments. So I'll go over real quickly what is on this change sheet. It basically clarifies some issues and corrects some typographical errors. And so the bullet list is provided on the screen. It's typographical and clarification changes include linking the design storm to the advanced BMPs. This was to advertise some of the infiltrative and low impact development type of techniques that are available. The bypass sampling requirements have been clarified so that folks know that they have to sample when there's a bypass. Similar BMPs for certain sampling requirements. This was a clarification made on behalf of a request to make it consistent with the 97 permit. The qualified industrial stormwater practitioner training requirements have been added as something that's required for a new discharger to evaluate whether they're going into impaired water bodies or contributing pollutants to impaired water bodies or not. Level 2, exceedance response action technical report requirements have been clarified and some typos fixed, and the legally responsible person definition for a corporation has been fixed or clarified to address some of the comments and the needs of the electronic reporting rule, CHROME-AIR from EPA. And then finally, a definition for no discharge has been amended to make it more clear. So in terms of parts of the permit that were changed, the fact sheet and the attachments and the appendices all contain some typographical and clarification changes as well. We added some rationale language to make it more clear what staff was intending. And then we added those 3 TMDLs that Laurel mentioned that are now in attachment D. And the assessment was that there is a possibility that industrial stormwater sources are part of those TMDLs, so we added those. And with that, it concludes the staff presentation. We're available for comments, obviously, and at this point, I'll hand it over to the panel.
Any questions before we begin comments? All right. All right. First, I have a panel, I guess, of Sarah Aminzadeh from Coast Keeper and Daniel Cooper for the keepers. No, it's fun.
It's not really a panel per se, just a
You wanted to
group
have one
comment.
group comment. All right.
Although Mike wanted me to note that he has an extensive PowerPoint presentation to give shortly. Greg asked me to do some sort of April Fool's joke, so that's my best. That's my best shot at levity today.
Do you want me to do a 10 minutes for all 3 of you sort of a thing?
Sure, I think that will be plenty of time. I don't think I need more than 3 minutes,
All right.
so whatever's easiest.
Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. Good morning, Chair Marcus, board members. I am Sarah Aminzadeh. I'm the Executive Director of California Coastkeeper Alliance. As you know, we represent 12 waterkeeper organizations throughout the state, most of whom are engaged in water quality monitoring and advocacy to mitigate California's various forms of polluted runoff on a daily basis. Collectively, our groups have been working closely over the past 2 years with the State Water Board to strengthen its various stormwater programs through our polluted runoff campaign. A couple of notes on polluted runoff impacts to sort of ground us in the very long process that we've gone through. California's urban bays, creeks, and rivers are heavily impacted by high concentrations of industrial pollutants such as toxic metals and petroleum hydrocarbons. San Francisco Baykeeper, Los Angeles Waterkeeper, Inland Empire Waterkeeper, and Orange County Coastkeeper work to reduce industrial polluted runoff impacts to local bays, creeks, and rivers. Polluted surface water impacts the ability of residents in areas like Riverside to use their local waterways, posing serious environmental justice concerns and disproportionate impacts to those who are most in need. The waterkeepers have come to Sacramento repeatedly during the development of this permit to provide an accounting of the current deficiencies with the industrial regulatory program at the local level. As just one example, San Francisco Baykeepers research shows that while 95% of Bay Area industrial facilities have violated the Clean Water Act in recent years, inspection and needed facility improvements occur at fewer than 5% of the region's industrial facilities. So turning now to the permit itself, several critical permit revisions have been made in response to our September 19th, 2013 comments. And I want to recognize staff's responsiveness and work with us throughout this process. Greg's need for therapy, perhaps not only today, but in the near future from that work.
There could be a group need, but
Yeah, I think
I'm happy to
following
lead you
that
all later in
would
an
be-
elective session if it helps.
That would be helpful. However, as a whole, we feel that the industrial permit ultimately fails to ensure the collection of more and better data, ensure compliance with water quality objectives, and improve the use of pollution control technology in a clear and objective way for all parties to determine compliance with the permit. These issues have been discussed in detail in our various comment letters submitted on October 22nd, 2012, September 19th, 2013, and March 4th, 2014, which I want to incorporate by reference today and ensure their inclusion in the record. Just a couple of high-level points. This final permit, we feel, lacks necessary requirements to improve our state's water qualities in several respects. First, the permit fails to conduct the BAT-BCT analysis required by the Clean Water Act and fails to provide the required protections to ensure that dischargers do not cause or contribute to exceedances of water quality standards for receiving waters. Second, this permit does not contain a framework and time frame to evaluate data and develop numeric limits given the presence of readily available and sufficient data. The State of Washington's Department of Ecology performed an analysis to develop numeric limits on industrial pollutants, and we feel that California should do the same. And third, if this permit is to serve as a bridge to numeric effluent limits in future permits, the proposed data collection methodologies will be undermined by the significant number of compliance off-ramps. Our local water keepers' direct experience suggests that many permittees are unable or unwilling to submit data via the current online reporting systems. Given this, a permit that sets up compliance off-ramps is unlikely to be easily and efficiently implemented. The off-ramps not only undermine the state board's interest in developing numerics in the next permit iteration, but this permit could also impede regional boards' efforts already underway to develop numerics for sector-specific permits such as that underway in Region 8. And finally, the Clean Water Act requires that available TMDLs be incorporated into the permit, and the proposed process for incorporating TMDLs cannot replace the mandates of the Clean Water Act, which are clear, that permits must be consistent with the waste load allocations of available TMDLs. Now, understanding that major revisions are unlikely at this stage, I offer a few, what I hope may be straightforward revisions that could be made before adoption, possibly today. 3 points. First, with respect to clarification of the permit coverage. During earlier discussions with staff, it has come up about specific SIC codes and what the coverage is there. And I feel that the state board should clarify that permits should cover all industrial activities as required by the Clean Water Act. That change we feel could and should be made. Second, with the suspension of monitoring requirements, the permit continues to allow permittees to suspend monitoring requirements despite our comments that a permittee may use a suspension to avoid monitoring during storm events. We request that the state board require the delay be more than 10 consecutive calendar days and that the permittee be required to provide further explanation as to why monitoring should be suspended. And we request that the board give clarification to the regional water boards that a request for temporary suspension should be denied for a facility attempting to circumvent enforcement during the wet season. And finally, with respect to NELs, which I raised earlier, I'd like to see a finding or a statement from the board that between today's adoption and the permit's implementation date, that staff will undertake the development of a framework for assessing industrial data to ensure that the board will pursue numeric limits. I know that there's a stormwater strategic plan process underway, and that might be an appropriate venue, but I'd like to see something that moves forward with the adoption of this permit, that is the state board's intent or goal. I think that would be very helpful for all the parties involved. Thank you.
Hello again, members of the board. I'm Daniel Cooper. And sorry, just to follow up on what Sarah was saying, I guess I have a couple questions, just clarifications. So one would be, with this new electronic reporting methodology, are all of the annual reports and SWPs and so on that are being submitted going to be maintained in a database so that there's essentially a historic record of compliance going back that the public and the dischargers and staff will have access to? There's an issue now about whether old SWPs are actually public documents. Some regional boards are taking the position that they're not and that we can't get them. And so I just want to confirm that the state board will in fact hang on to that stuff that's in the new database.
Yeah, the database, effective when the electronic reporting requirements kick in, we'll retain all those records in a way that's consistent with the electronic reporting rule, which requires us to not only log anyone coming in and making an amendment or a change to one of those documents, but it'll store the old documents as well. This is consistent with how the construction general permit handles the same kind of records. But it won't go back in time necessarily and pull in all the previous annual reports and SWPs that you may think are part of the record, because those are in paper and they're not being scanned in.
Fair enough. I'm referring to July 2014. Okay. And then my second question would be on NALs. In some of our current enforcement actions, we're hearing from dischargers and defendants that NALs are a definitive determination of compliance with or without the permit. And I know in the response to comments, they were actually very detailed, and thank you for that. I just want to clarify that NALs are a trigger for the Tier 1, Tier 2 process and are not a determinant either for or against compliance with the permit. Is that a fair interpretation of their purpose?
Yes, I agree with that statement.
Okay. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Chair Marcus, members of the board, Mike Lozo here for California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance and CWIN. I'd like to move to sever myself from the panel so I have 3 minutes instead of 2. But I should be able to, no, I'm just kidding. April Fools. Okay. I just have 2 comments that reflect the last letter we sent in, 2 concerns we have about the last version of the permit here. One is the BCT reference in Section 5A, which is the basic provision requiring compliance with those technology standards, and there's still this lingering word of practicability, and the response to comments refers us to the multi-sector permit by EPA, but practicability only comes into play for best practicable technology requirement. BPT went out in 1989 and was replaced by BAT and BCT. There is no more BPT standard that could be applied legally, and there's certainly no authority for either EPA or the State Board to rerun through the history of the Clean Water Act and its technology tiers in any given permit. We're already at BAT and BCT. So the lingering word of practicability, which is not in either of those 2 standards, it is referenced in the BCT standard in terms of you can do it sooner than 1989 if practicable, but that's the only reference. The conventional technology or best available technology, there is no reference to practicability, and I think it's misleading, not helpful to the layperson. So we would ask that just delete that word, please. It all hangs together, even if you just delete practicability. I think there's an and you have to delete as well. On the other issue that we're having is just the NALs and the fact that they're based on a hardness, or some of the metals, 6 of the metals, are based on a hardness value, which is the maximum hardness value that is in the range that EPA uses in its multi-sector, which is a hardness of 400. And in our experience going from site to site all over the state and looking at some of the TMDL documents and monitoring documents, you know, there are essentially no water bodies during the rainy season that generally come close to a hardness of 400. So you're basically picking NALs that for something like the Sacramento River, which in the area of West Sacramento or so, you know, the hardness is like 25. Maybe it bumps up to 40 on occasion, but it's generally in the 20s, 30s. You're basically guaranteeing a very high level for those metals, and somehow that's okay and is going to both drive technology as well as protect water quality standards. And my understanding is the NALs are supposed to be sort of shooting for both. But 400 is just kind of an exorbitant hardness number, given what actually occurs in the state. Even down south in LA, during the rains, mind you, during rainy season, you don't look at the dry season isn't relevant for an industrial stormwater permit, and you don't see numbers like that in the rainy season, certainly not on any kind of regular basis. So I think the NALs should at least reflect like what EPA does, which is they have the range, and you fit into various ranges of hardness, and that's the number you get depending on the hardness prevalent in your area. It doesn't. No one's asking for some complicated monitoring to figure out what the hardness is, but there are these documents that give us general hardness figures that are useful. So unless there's questions, thank you very much for your time, and good luck finishing this today.
Thanks. Just a couple of questions for a response to the staff, actually, on some of the panel issues. And let me see my notes. Can you respond to the all industrial activities comment that Sarah made? Like, have we exempted some SIC codes that we shouldn't have? What's the?
No, the permit language and the scope of the net, so to speak, that this permit captures is no different really than 91 and 97 efforts to reissue the permit. So this is the same basis that we've been using all along. We haven't amended it whatsoever. So if there's additional clarification that is desired or needed, we're not aware of that. We have to clarify sometimes what the no exposure certification is doing. It's changing the people that were caught in the 97 permit. It's changing the notification requirements on them. So we may not know who they are, and they may not know that they're part of the permit. But other than that, the actual SIC code basis of this permit is no different than 97 and 92.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to clarify what your
Yeah.
point is there? Just
So
I
the comment actually.
I should know
came-
this, but
Yeah, the comment actually came from our local water keepers that the SIC codes, some are outdated and outmoded, so that there are some industrial activities that are not covered by them. For instance, an amusement park might not be considered an industrial activity, but there might be industrial pollution associated with it. And there are other examples as well that we could talk about. But that was the comment, is basically, that's the point, is
That's
that
the
they
bigger
haven't been
question.
updated since 1997 or 1992, and there are many other practices and industries that are happening now that just aren't covered.
yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, that's been an issue that we have figured out. It's hard to just do that in this permit, but that is definitely an issue that is on deck for us to try and figure out how to work with our fellow agencies to make sure that there's better coverage on that. That's a good point.
And just a related comment too was that and some of the parameters associated with the existing SIC codes are also not comprehensive enough.
So I'll just add that EPA is aware of the issue with the SIC codes. It's something that is actually on a national issue list. And so the effort to update the SIC codes, the Standard Industrial Classification Code System, has been something that's been brought up to EPA for years. I don't know where they're at, but from our council's advice, until EPA updates the regulations that implement those SIC codes and brings them up to speed with what's now called the National NAICS, I don't remember what it all stands for, but it's a new code system for industrial
It's good that
classification.
you know what it is, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those acronyms that I've chosen not to memorize.
If it's not an IP, it's not important to me.
So when they do that, then we will abide by whatever the new rule says.
Can we, just as a note, this isn't something for, just to remind me, let's set up a meeting with EPA to talk about this, because there are just a number of things that hang us up that are complicated for us to do that they ought to be doing. I know they're under a lot of pressure, and they have the same kind of budget constraints we do in the last few years, perhaps even worse. But I'd like to just take it to a conversation with them, both at the region and with somebody from headquarters. So I'm happy to help you with that.
And if I could just add, even though the SIC codes may not be currently all the way up to date, the regional boards do have, under this permit, the authority to designate individual facilities that are significant contributors of pollutants as requiring to either obtain an individual permit or coverage under this permit. So
Right, that's good. Thank you for making that point. I mean, that takes a bunch of work, but it's that way, at least where people point out a particularly egregious example, there's some ability to take action. Do you want to comment? Will you comment on the hardness value issue? That's not something I know. That's sort of basic science, but again, I'm the narrative wing here.
So we went through this in more detail at least 2 drafts ago that I remember. So I'll try to remember what we said then, but it's very clear in my head the logic. What EPA did with their multi-sector general permit is they took what are essentially called water quality criteria that are available to anyone that wants to enforce a water quality standard. These criteria values, they have ambient values for protecting certain aquatic organisms. They use the freshwater basis set of numbers as well as the saltwater set of numbers. And they established these MSGP benchmark values in their permit using those numbers and applying a relatively crude dilution factor and then calling them benchmark values as guidance. The hardness value is attached to that criteria value. So in California's case, a couple of years ago, we were under significant pressure to reduce all unnecessary complexity, costs, et cetera, and in staff's opinion, it was misleading to try to resolve these out as water quality-based action levels, because they're not. They're a combination of technology-based, they're guidance values. They don't relate directly to the the water body that's nearby. In fact, if we were to enforce a water quality standard at a facility, we might not even use that basis number, that same value. So the hardness value, in staff's opinion, was unnecessary, it was misleading, and it simplified a lot of the communication about this permit if we made it a conservative assumption. And so that's what staff has done. We maintain that that's the right approach today.
So it's an indicator.
It's an indicator value, and we made an assumption about the hardness to make it relatively more user-friendly for folks.
Other questions of the panel? Okay, Steve?
Oh, I just, if you could respond to the concern that the sector-specific permits and, for instance, Region 8 that was referred to are somehow undermined by our approach. It wasn't clear.
Good question.
So there's one sector-specific industrial permit that I'm aware of, and it's in Region 8, and it deals with metal scrap recyclers. It was adopted a couple years ago. I think they were trying to time it to be coincidental with one of our drafts. It's created a bit of a confusion in the realm because they used some terms of art that were in our draft that are now no longer in our permit. But my understanding is that it's got water quality-based numeric effluent limits in it as an option, or a technology standard that the dischargers can choose. I'm not aware of any facility that has chosen to go down the water quality-based effluent limit route. So I'm not really sure we're getting progress on developing a sector-based, numeric-based permit. Remember, water quality-based effluent limits are much easier to derive than technology-based. You basically back it out, like I was describing a minute ago, from the receiving water, the criteria that you want to use, the beneficial uses that you want to protect, and you back it out to a protective number. Technology-based limits are much more challenging, which is why staff has kept struggling with it. And so I'm not sure there's a real strong correlation between what is happening in Region 8 on their numerics approach and what the state needs to do for a sector-based approach in our next reissuance.
So it's not clear that there's an undermining, that these can go in parallel, that the region can continue to work through that process they've started.
Correct. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
I could provide a little more perspective on what's going on with the sector-specific permit if you're interested.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think what's going on right now, is my understanding, is there was data collection occurring over the last couple of wet seasons after the sector-specific permit was adopted in order to back out BAT, BCT, and what is the performance of current BMPs for scrap metal facilities, and then develop standards on that basis, because the position of certainly state board staff and the regional boards too is that the data set is inadequate to do that exercise. So they're in the process of doing it, and I think the local concern and what they're observing is participants are backing out of that process, no longer participating in the data collection because they view this current industrial permit as so much less stringent, they'd rather just come under its terms and live with that. So that has been the issue, and the perception is, you know, take it for what it is, the perception is nobody has to do anything until July of 2015, and then after that, the data comes in. If they're above NALs, they have a year, plus another year, perhaps another year, before any real traction under this new permit. So the perception in the field is everyone's bought themselves until 2017 actually have to do anything, and that will only be complying with these, in our view, extremely high NALs, rather than benchmarks or other indicators of BAT, BCT, or water quality standards for the water quality half of the permit. So that's the perception in the field, and that's the concern that OCCK has and Inland Empire Waterkeeper has about this permit causing problems for development of more stringent or more specific